All right, guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about the 38 caliber family of pistol cartridges, just the pistol cartridges in this case. There's going to be rifle's going to work its way a little bit in there, but it's not going to, like, rifles are not necessarily what we're pursuing in this case. There are a couple of examples that is not going to be discussed. This is not necessarily going to be an in-depth discussion on the 38 Special. If that is what you're interested in, I have previously done a cartridge discussion video on the 38 Special. The link will be in the description. This is going to be more akin to the 22 Rimfire family video that I did a little while back, which if you're interested in that, link in the description. What I primarily want to discuss is kind of the history and development, the flow of the 38 throughout firearms history, because the 38 is one of the earliest self-contained metallic cartridges that was utilized, and has gone through many different naming trends and stuff like that that's actually its own kind of cross-section of cartridge development history. And I find this very interesting, and I want to have this discussion here with you today. All right, so now that we've kind of outlined what it is that we're going to discuss, let's go ahead and get started. One of the things that I find most interesting about the 38 caliber cartridge is that the actual nominal bullet diameter is 0.357. Well, that is not 38, Murph. Why do they refer to it as a 38? And that is getting a better understanding of how cartridge designation is derived, and then how the 38 went a completely different direction. So normally, what we expect to have happen is that we derive our cartridge designation by the diameter of the projectile. So 40 caliber is 0.40 inches. 10 millimeter is 10 millimeters in diameter. That type of deal. That's what we normally expect. However, that's not necessarily how it always works out. Sometimes the cartridge designation comes from bore diameter, which can be measured from the top of the lands or the bottom of the grooves. Just depends on how somebody felt like doing it that day. In this case, the 38 is neither. The 38 is actually deriving its designation from the case mouth diameter, which obviously is a little bit bigger than the projectile itself, so that the projectile can be seated inside of the casing. Why did they choose to do that? I have no earthly idea. It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know why someone specifically was like, this one we're going to measure from the cartridge casing. I can only assume that since cartridge casings were so new, they were like, well, obviously we're all going to make cartridge designations based off of the cartridge casing, duh. Where previously they would have just worked off a bullet diameter. Now, when the 38 came out, it was to be used in conjunction with 36 caliber percussion revolvers that were being converted to cartridge firing guns, which is kind of a cool thing all by itself. You know, taking something that you already had and repurposing it to be able to be updated to the newest technology. It'd be like converting your Glock to a laser gun type of deal. Maybe not that drastic, but you get what it is that I'm saying. The thrifty aspect of it that's associated with that. So they would bore through the cylinders and then load it up with these .357 caliber projectiles set into a 38 caliber neck. And for some reason they picked the neck to pull the diameter from. I'll never understand. Colt would produce this loading in both the 38 long Colt and, starting in the 1870s, a 38 short Colt for their new series of swing out cylinder revolvers. Now, Colt would also have a model adopted by the United States Army in 1892, chambered in 38 long Colt, and it would serve through the Spanish-American War into some of the issues in the Philippines, where it would be discovered in the Philippines that this cartridge was not effectively stopping enemy combatants. This would give the United States Army a really bad taste in its mouth for the 38, and it would sideline the 38 Colt and reduce any interest the U.S. Army had in adopting a 38 in the future. Now, that does not mean that the 38 Colt was gone forever. It would still be popular amongst police and detectives and stuff like that. Very popular in lightweight snub-nose revolvers because it is such a light recoiling cartridge. Now, the Army would, of course, decide that they want to go after... Oh, wow, that's smooth. That's a little sweet. It's a little like honey. Anyway, this is the first sip I've tasted of this. The Army would decide that they wanted to go back to 45 caliber projectiles, and they wanted to adopt a semi-automatic handgun, and this is how, ipso facto, we got the 1911 produced by Colt, designed by John Moses Browning, hereafter referred to as JMB. So, another thing that I find interesting from this time period is that manufacturers did not like to use each other's designations. And it was like they didn't want to give the other guy free press. They were competing after all. So why would they, if, Colt developed the 38 Colt, why would Smith & Wesson want to use the 38 Colt? That might confuse people as to what gun it is that they're shooting and what it is that they walked into the store to buy that particular day. So Smith & Wesson had its own designation, the 38 Smith & Wesson, which honestly is a lot like if, when Glock decided to get into the 40 Smith & Wesson game, and they decided they didn't want to call their loading the 40 Smith & Wesson. They wanted to make their own loading called the 40 Glock, which maybe it would have some minor differences in like the shape of the projectile. Maybe you could find that in different loads than what you could find in a 40 Smith & Wesson, but the two cartridges would more or less be interchangeable. Smith & Wesson chose to do a couple of interesting things with the 38. In the 1890s, they would develop the 38-44 Target, which would be chambered in a variant of their Smith & Wesson No. 3 revolvers, which are sometimes improperly referred to as Schofields, but keep in mind that a Schofield has a very specific set of features that are not on every Smith & Wesson No. 3. So a Schofield is a Smith & Wesson No. 3, but not all Smith & Wesson No. 3s are Schofields. A little bit of a rabbit hole there, but we'll get back on track. Why was this referred to as the 38-44? Well, this is where we again get a weird cartridge designation, because 38-44 has pretty much nothing to do with the actual cartridge. The platform is a 38-44. It is a 44 caliber frame with a 38 barrel on it. The idea being that you'd have this heavier frame that would give you better recoil management with the lighter cartridge. And the number 3 had, this particular number 3 had like adjustable sights and all that kind of stuff. And the cartridge that it shot was a special 38-44 target load, which had the bullet recessed all the way inside of the cartridge casing, similar to a 7.62 Nagant. However, it did not necessarily have the same like gas seal system that the 7.62 Nagant is known for. So it's an interesting choice overall. This cartridge is completely defunct now. So like where you might still be able to find some 38 Smith & Wesson or some 38 Colt, you will probably never find 38-44, like factory 38-44 Target. Now, to go along with this 38-44 Target, there would also be a 38-44 Heavy. And this would be the same overall idea. This would go into a larger framed revolver, and it would have a slightly longer cartridge casing, 38 cartridge with an exposed projectile, the standard type of cartridge casing that you expect to see. And the velocities would be up over 1,000 feet per second. That's pretty good for the time period, especially when we're talking about handgun cartridges and the 38 in general, which I would normally associate the 38 with very low velocities because it is a very low pressure cartridge. Now, the issue with the 38-44 is it's not really interchangeable with the other 38s. Though it might be able to be chambered in a 38 special, it's bringing in significantly higher velocities. Not all 38 special chambered guns are going to handle it very well. But 357 Magnum guns would handle it just fine. And really, it's the 357 Magnum that put the 38-44 to rest because, and really it's kind of a 1-2 punch between the 38 special and the 357 Magnum. So the whole point of 38-44 was, again, a 44 caliber frame with this teeny tiny projectile. Well, that's all well and good for comfort of shooting and all that kind of stuff. But when you're talking about carrying it all day, no, that's not very fun. It's really going to weigh down your belt. It's maybe not the best concealed carry option. And it's still a 38 at the end of the day, so it's not even necessarily a great woods option. The 38 Special could be chambered in lighter weight guns, which would be more favorable for carry, be it concealed or duty type use. And the 357 Magnum blows it out of the water in velocity and energy, so it kind of like phased itself out by being so niche to begin with. And it'd be very difficult to find 38-44 ammunition here today. Now, after seeing the issues that the U.S. Army had with the 38 Colt, Smith & Wesson started to take notice, and they would produce the 38 Smith & Wesson Special. Again, previously discussed on the channel. And this would be a slightly longer cartridge casing with a little bit more powder. And this has led a lot of people to say that the 38 Special is more powerful than like 9mm or 380 or something along those lines. And they're entirely looking at the length of the cartridge casing. But, as I mentioned in the dedicated video, if you look at velocity and energy and mass and all that kind of stuff, it's really not grossing that high of numbers. It's a pretty low pressure round. I mean, you're staying under 1,000 feet per second for the most part. It's really not that potent. Now, it has some other characteristics that still make it an effective option, but more powerful is really the wrong word to use in this case. I would use, based off of it being a larger cartridge that's bringing in lower velocities and lower energy and all that kind of stuff than 9mm, I would call it an inefficient cartridge. Probably an unpopular opinion, but I don't really care in this case. Now, the 38 Special, regardless, would be a very popular cartridge all throughout the 20th century and still has some use today as a defensive option. I carry 38 snub noses quite frequently. I'm not bothered by the rather anemic performance overall, because for what it is that I'm intending to use it for, it is more than adequate. Now, would I take it into a dedicated gunfight? Absolutely not, but we're getting down a rabbit hole, and I'm going to go ahead and pull myself off of that right now. Now, that would not be the last gasp with the 38 Smith & Wesson. During the Roaring 20s, Smith & Wesson would come out with the 38-200 load, which would be the super police in this case. And this was a larger projectile meant to exert more energy on target and all that kind of stuff. Kind of get it closer to like a 45 ACP. Now, the British would take notice of this, and when they started contracting with the United States on the Lend-Lease program to get guns for World War II, they would seek out that 38-200 because they would accurately replicate the 4.55 Webley without having to make, like, Smith & Wesson do a whole bunch of retooling for its product line and all that kind of stuff. And these would be the Victory model revolvers. I really wanted Victory very badly, but they're kind of hard to come by, as it would turn out. That would pretty much be the extent of the popularity of the 38-200. The 38 Smith & Wesson would stick around for a little while, but by the 70s, it was really waxing towards anonymity, I guess you could say, at that point, and it would see itself fizzle out. You'll be hard-pressed to find 38 Smith & Wesson or 38-200 ammunition. All right, well, there's those cartridges that we've discussed. What about Winchester? What was Winchester doing at the time? Well, in the 1800s, Winchester did come out with their own 38 designation for the Winchester Model 1873 and later 1892 rifles. This is the rifle portion that I was talking about before. This would be called the 3840 Winchester. However, what's misleading about this is not actually a 38 caliber projectile. It's a 40 caliber projectile. So we have a little bit of another nomenclature departure here. Normally at this time period with black powder cartridges, you would identify the cartridge diameter or the bullet diameter followed by the number of grains of powder, 4440, 4570, so on and so forth. Winchester decided for some reason to reverse that and instead designate the number of grains of black powder, 38 in this case, and then projectile diameter, 40 caliber. Now, this would be a relatively popular option because it is light recoiling, but you would see a lot more, or you would see that popularity flow over into like Colt revolvers and stuff like that. People who wanted to have a rifle and a handgun chambered in the same cartridge to be able to interchange between the two. By like 1937, the 3840 was pretty much gone by the wayside. You'd be hard pressed to find factory ammunition here today. And really, any that's been produced has just been because of interest in like cowboy action shooting, which kind of tells you how niche that is and how expensive it's most likely going to be. In addition to that, there was like a rifle-only load in about 180 grain loading that was developed for a little bit. It's very important to keep in mind that that's really not rated for revolvers. So something to keep in mind with that. Okay, so we spent a lot of time talking about revolvers. Are there any semi-automatic versions of the 38? And actually, there's quite a few. So first off, we have the 38 ACP, designed by John Moses Browning just past the turn of the century, with an eye towards military contracts. However, the military quickly dropped the idea of 38. JMB started working on a 45 ACP, and then the rest is history. We're not really going to get into the 45 ACP discussion. I do have a completely separate video on that. If you're interested in that, link in the description. Now, the 38 ACP more or less pulled in the same velocity for like 9mm at that time period, and while interesting, it didn't really catch on. However, in the 1920s, there would become a demand for a cartridge that could better deal with auto glass, and this is where we get the 38 Super. This would be a 38 ACP that had itself a little bit more hopped up. It would be like more potent 9mm for the time period, now online with current production 9mm. And Actually, I kind of used this as part of my 9mm discussion on the revisit that I did. The link to both the original and revisit videos for 9mm will be in the description as well. So this cartridge came along and it was supposed to be this like really awesome like police cartridge to be able to like better deal with cars and everything like that. The Thompson would be produced in it for a little while, which that would be really neat to see. And the 38 ACP and 38 Super would actually be popular in like Mexico and South America because those are countries where you cannot own the same cartridges that are used by the military. Guns chambered in those same cartridges are not legal for civilian ownership. So the 38 ACP has really thrived there. I, for a really long time, have wanted a 38 ACP chambered 1911. It's just that I don't come across them very often. I remember years ago I read an article about someone had introduced this like highly polished stainless steel 1911 chambered in 38 Super, and it looked like something that you were supposed to be sitting like on a porch at like a hacienda or something like that in Mexico, smoking a cigar, sipping on some tequila or something like that with that poking out of your waistband. It seemed like a really cool option. I would really like to get one. It's really low on my to-do list because I don't have anything else chambered in 38 AC or 38 Super. Now the 38 Super has remained a popular competition cartridge in like IPSC and stuff like that. But popular is kind of in quotations in this case. I remember a gun shop that I used to frequent all throughout like the pandemic and all that kind of stuff. They had like 8 or 9 boxes of 38 Super sitting on the shelf, and those same boxes have been sitting there since 2020. Even with all the ammo rushes and all that kind of stuff, nobody apparently had the interest in buying a 38 Super. So I still also remember it was like $25 a box or something like that. Like 50 cents a round, which, while not the most expensive, is still pretty expensive. You know, it's not like the $30 a box I'm seeing for 38 Special right now, but it is very comparable to like 45 ACP prices in the current environment. Of course, that's always open to change. That's how things work. Okay, there's those 2 cartridges, very interesting cartridges all on their own. Then we have the 38 casull, which was a custom cartridge put together by a gentleman of the same name for a series of custom 1911s that his company would build. And this was basically a 45 ACP cartridge, though the original parent cartridge was slightly longer than 45 ACP. However, it would get necked down to 38 caliber, which would put it at the same length as a 45 ACP once the necking was complete. And this gave you this incredibly high pressure, high velocity 38 semi-automatic loading. So you're still talking about like 115 grain bullets. It's basically a 9mm in a necked down 45 ACP cartridge casing. And you're talking 1600 to 1800 feet per second. Massive muzzle blast, a good amount of recoil, a very potent cartridge. And actually, the manufacturer of this cartridge states that it should only be used in their custom guns because their metallurgy or whatever is appropriately tuned to be able to handle the pressures of that particular cartridge. I don't know how true that is, but when you consider those velocities in a handgun, I could see it. I could understand that completely. The 1911 design has not always favorably handled really high pressure cartridges. There were some issues in like the Colt Delta Elites when the 10mm first came out and all that kind of stuff, and still some prejudice against 1911s chambered in 10mm when you're talking about true barn burner 10mm that everyone thinks they're getting when they run out and buy like a box of Arms Corps that's really more like 10mm light. That's a discussion for a completely different video that I actually already did in the past, that 10mm auto video, link in the description. Anyway, so there's our 38 family. There's one thing that all of these cartridges have in common. On the older ones, of course, its availability, it's going to be very low, but cost. Cost is going to be very high for all of these different types of ammunition. And that's one of the things that I think has really caused the 38 to go on its way out. Because 357 Magnum is also expensive and at the same bullet diameter. However, it brings a lot of performance benefits for its cost that really help you kind of work out your cost benefit analysis there. When you talk about 38 Special or 38 Colt or any of these types of cartridges, it's really not there. Not in the face of modern semi-automatic cartridges and higher capacity options. You're not being chained to revolvers and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the thing to keep in mind. I find the history of this very interesting, but it's important to sometimes ground history in a little bit of like fact, right? A little bit of reality of like, yes, while these are very cool, this does not mean that they are still viable options. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.